Pleasure to be with you guys. Ben Morgan, as a colleague here, just generously introduced us. I guess a little background on myself. I work in an accounting firm now, but my entire career has been in business valuation in one variety or another. Historically, I've done a lot of portfolio analysis for private equity firms, hedge funds, investment companies, valuing illiquid assets, debt and equity. At Brown Smith Wallace, I focus primarily in our transaction advisory practice, where I do a lot of gift and estate planning, valuations of privately held companies, and in the family law arena, we do valuations for divorcing business owners. So our primary objective here is to educate you guys a little bit about the process of business valuation, things that we think about as valuation experts when we're going through evaluation, and then try to flag a few things for valuations that are performed in the litigated arena. There's a lot of judgment that's involved with valuations in the first place, so that's one of the big areas that are typically contested. So we'll try to point out a few things that come up more frequently than not in a litigated setting.
Yeah, so I'm Matt Byford. I work with Ben here in the transaction advisory litigation support practice at Brown Smith Wallace. We're both valuation guys. My focus of the practice is typically on litigated matters, so I'd say probably 80% or so. So, Ben's going to go through the mechanics of business valuation, and I'm going to try to kind of shed some light in a litigated context for you guys, hopefully help you understand some of the questions you can ask in direct or cross-examination, depositions, in court, things like that. So.
All right. You have to bear with me if I screw up forward and backwards here. So this is kind of a general outline. I kind of walked through a little bit of this before. But again, we're just trying to introduce you to the concept of business valuation, some of the approaches, methodologies that we'll typically use, key assumptions, the concept of normalizing financial statements or cash flows, things to consider when you're trying to point out supportable adjustments or add backs. And then we'll walk through discount rates, returns, how those are developed, things, inputs, key inputs there, what it really means, how does it impact value. Discounts and premiums is an interesting concept that is highly judgment-based, although there's some research that we'll kind of talk about. However, it's one of those key points of contention often in a litigated scenario. And then on deliverables, we'll tell you a little bit about kind of what you might expect to see when you hire a valuation expert to perform analysis. So on valuation, there's a few, I can just jump right in. Some regulatory bodies that provide either guidance on defined terms, white papers on how to perform analysis. One of the ones that we'll obviously look to when we're doing some type of gift and estate planning that's going to be reviewed by the IRS is definitions and terms provided by them, because this is exactly what they're looking for. So we want to make sure we cover all our bases. And one of the key revenue rulings is this 5960 that was written back in '59. It's been around, still used to this day. That spells out a lot of the key factors to consider when performing evaluation. So obviously things like the overall economy, the specific industry of the company under consideration, several of these factors that you really want to make sure that anybody who's performing the analysis is going to take into consideration.
So yeah, basically the way we've kind of set this up is, we'll talk about valuation, and then we've got some slides that we're trying to gear more towards the litigated setting. So here, I would never go into a deposition and ask your opposing expert, have you considered Revenue Ruling 5960? But Revenue Ruling 5960 does provide some guidance for some good questions to ask, such as, Mr. Morgan, have you considered an economic, the general economy in your analysis? Right. You would say yes, and then
of course.
What did you review? And you could say, well, I noticed that the economy is growing rather sluggishly in the past year in the United States, and this is, the economy that this particular business operates. And so then, you as an attorney could ask, so how does that impact your analysis? And so that can kind of give you an idea to kind of pick the opposing expert's brain and really to make sure that he's credible and he's actually done the legwork that he needs to do to make his valuation supportable. So if they're not answering these questions in a way that sounds reasonable, then it kind of will throw up some red flags.
Right. And even if it wasn't a specific consideration, you would hope that a valuation professional will have some kind of answer in his back pocket about how you would incorporate economic changes overall in their analysis. One of the really interesting pieces about that specific piece of literature put out by the IRS is the definition of fair market value, which is still used. There's some interesting pieces of the definition that are really important in the valuation context. Essentially, it's the price for a willing buyer, willing seller, with no compulsion to buy, and when both parties have reasonable knowledge of the relevant facts. So it's a loaded definition because there's a lot in there that, well, does one party know everything there is to know about the business, or what would be reasonable for that person to know if they were to actually be buying the business? And that comes into play when you're talking about a valuation where you're engaged by maybe one party that doesn't have all the information, and you don't have access to management or people who are familiar with the operations. So that can have an impact when you get to a litigated setting where you don't have the transparency. So you kind of run the risk of, well, are you doing a real fair market value analysis when you don't have all of the relevant facts? Another important body in the valuation community in general is the FASB. It comes into play a little bit more in financial reporting valuations, which would be for business combination. So that's a little bit more public company type stuff when you're valuing intangible assets and like these trademarks, trade names, customer relationships, patents. However, it could come into play if, for any reason, a divorcing spouse has ownership interests in patent rights, for example. Some credentialing organizations that are important to consider when you're selecting an expert or someone to work with in performing evaluation, kind of listed out here. There's a few organizations that, as a valuation professional, we feel there are maybe more credibility in than others. Myself and Matt are both CFAs. We know kind of what it took to get that credential, and so we've got some faith that there's, anybody who's kind of gone through that process is taking some time and kind of knows their stuff. Organizations like the ASA, there's significant time investment, and there's curriculum that's valuation specific. It's several weeks of courses that you'd have to go through to get the credential, so it's another good one that's kind of looked upon with favor. And then kind of go down the list in order of maybe credibility, I guess you'd say. And the last one is kind of a key point where we oftentimes see CPAs performing valuation exercises, and we definitely want to caution you that a CPA is not a valuation credential. They're certainly not valuation experts. They obviously have their own specialty, but we've seen the output from many accountants, and they often miss a lot of the key considerations, and it's from a review perspective, we see it as a little bit sloppy, so it's a cautionary point.
Yeah, I would say if one of the main things to take away today would be that if someone is only a CPA, accountants can do a lot of things, but they're just not qualified to do a business valuation. That doesn't mean that, they may have, a CPA and then accredited in business valuation. I would say that that certainly makes them credible as far as being a valuation expert. But I've seen many times opposing experts that only have the CPA credential, and I always question the validity of their analysis. So you also want to ask, in the beginning of a deposition, I would ask, what professional organizations do you belong to? Just a little side note that's interesting that I see a lot. The National Association of Certified Valuators and Analysts, which is NACVA, they actually changed their name a few years ago. They used to be the National Association of Certified Valuation Analysts, and there are a lot of guys out there that still have not made the change on their CVs or still don't even know that the name ever changed. And so I've seen that multiple times, and that typically throws up a red flag to me right away that, hey, probably, they may not be keeping up on industry standards. Kristen. Well, yeah, I would say just first off that your own accountant wouldn't be independent. And so that's a big problem credibility-wise. And but also, I would just ask them if their accountants, ever done a business valuation before, and and they may say yes, but that I would be wary of that. So, but I think the easiest way to go about this is to say, hey, it's there's an independence issue.
I think you ask them one question. You ask them how you're going to do it. Tell me how you're going to perform this analysis, accountant. They'll say, "Oh, I got to look it up online or something like that, right?" I don't know. This
is something that we've spent a substantial portion of our lives doing, and so you can go and kind of find the mechanics online, but there's so many nuances that that just take years of experience to pick up on that it doesn't work like that. I would also ask an opposing expert in a deposition what standards they used in preparation of their report. The AICPA has the Statement of Standards for Valuation, SSVS 1, and then also the ASA has USPAP, USPAP. Those are recognized standards for how valuation reports are structured, and I would say that if a report is done in either of those two, under either of those two guidelines, that the valuation expert probably knows what they're doing.
Many a reason to get evaluation performed. Like I mentioned before, we do a lot of work for exit planning, M&A pre-deal work, due diligence type activities, of course, valuations for divorce setting, gift and estate tax planning. Some of it's financial reporting for public companies. There's a ton of reasons. So the concepts are widespread, and there's a lot of different applications for the types of analysis. So it's not just necessarily for any one purpose. You can do this type of work for business owners in general. Some of it's for compensation, setting comp, setting management incentives, all kinds of stuff. It's kind of important because there's situations where a valuation might have been performed for one reason, and then all of a sudden there's a litigation setting where the valuation might need to be performed again for a different type of reason. So, for example, let's say there's a capital raise or shares were sold in December. All of a sudden there's a divorce in, March something. The analysis that's performed for a transaction to sell shares is potentially different than the transaction related to disagreement between spouses. There's a couple of things that go on as far as different timing we'll kind of talk about later, but the motivations for evaluation can lead to very different results. Even if you think about buy side, sell side, if you're selling a business, you want a really high valuation. If you're buying a business, you want a low valuation. So there's that natural conflict there that depending on who your client is, you're motivated to get a number. So that certainly has an impact and certainly something to think about. However, there's this concept of fair market value where you should really be considering buyer and seller, and there's a price kind of in the middle that you would hope to get to. Anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say that, this kind of goes back to what Kristen was asking about, cutting corners and, I want somebody else to do a valuation or whatever. I've seen situations where someone's getting divorced and he just had a valuation performed for some other reason. It's like, well, we already have this valuation. Let's just use this and, save money or whatever. But it doesn't really work like that because, like Ben said, there are different purposes can mean several different things as far as the value goes or the mechanics of the valuation. So, and then also I would just want to ask in a deposition or at trial or maybe even just during discovery what if the opposing expert is aware of any sort of other valuations that have been performed on the company in the past. And it's also important to know who reviewed the expert's analysis because, did the client have input on this? Did the client's accountant have input on it? Did, you just want to know who's seen the report, who's seen drafts, things like that.
And I like to know who's going to see my report. It certainly helps if you know that it's going to be scrutinized by another expert versus management or an attorney or whoever it may be. Obviously we take a lot of care in putting together the highest quality valuation schedules that we can. However, if you know that there's more scrutiny for one reason or another, there's certainly things that we can do as far as documenting assumptions and things like that we might kind of go the extra mile on. Standards of value, kind of hit on fair market value before, but there are a few other definitions that could come up. One to potentially highlight is that strategic or investment value. That would be a value to a specific person versus a willing buyer, willing seller. That kind of brings into the concept of synergies or an investment value, meaning I might think a business is worth something more than a willing buyer because I have a competing business down the street and it's going to make more sense for me to pay a little bit more for that business to put them out of business, or I'll get some synergies by merging the two, something like that. Will 90% of the time assume a going concern, meaning the business is going to be continuing on as is. However, there could be situations where you would look at other types of premises. Maybe there's a shareholder agreement that stipulates you'll use book value or something like that, or liquidation value is a little bit more of, well, the business is not performing well and we want to shut things down, so certainly help out with preparing an analysis like that. However, typically just doesn't come up. This concept of known or knowable, we hit on a little bit before as far as when we're performing evaluation, it's as of a specific date. And the information that we rely upon in deriving that value should not include anything that's after that date, subsequent events. It's can definitely come up in the divorce setting when we're talking about maybe one or both of the people in the marriage are involved in the business, and then all of a sudden it's, well, we've set a valuation date, maybe it's year end, and then divorce starts happening, and, well, one or both of them stop performing at the level that they were performing at before in the business. And so our position would be, well, we're valuing it at year end, and here's how the business looked at year end. However, things have kind of fallen apart. So, like, well, you know, are we supposed to take that into consideration? And our perspective is no, well, unless we move the valuation date forward and start thinking about, well, what's the business like today, then you should not be considering sort of those events after the fact. It goes for the financial information. Yeah,
we try to, a lot of times, we try to coordinate with the opposing expert to set a valuation date. It's like, okay, you know, both of us are going to do 12/31/2016, and that kind of helps as far as you know, everybody's looking at the same time frame. So then you don't have as much to worry about as far as the subsequent events and things like that. Another important thing is the forward-looking estimates. So in my experience, the Missouri courts do not like projections, and that is because it basically looks into post-marital cash flows and things that are happening after the marriage, and kind of using them in the marital dissolution. So what we do, and Ben will go through this later, is we use a normalized earnings approach and capitalize that going forward. So if you ever see an expert using projections, I would say that it's probably going to be some pretty low-hanging fruit as far as, you know, cross-examining them and bringing those projections into doubt.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge with anything forward-looking is that there's a lot of judgment involved. Nobody can see the future. So anything that's, you know, not historical and actual results is based on some assumption that management's made, or, you know, ownership who's getting divorced, whoever it is. And, you know, as a valuation professional, you can certainly test those assumptions and say, well, I don't know if they're reasonable. However, we're relying on management for a lot and ownership for a lot as far as inputs into our analysis. They know the business better than we know it. As much research as we can do, and as many questions as we can ask, and as much time as we can spend with them, you know, it's their business. So, you know, it boils down to, you know, they've given us some kind of forward-looking estimate, and it's hard to you know, challenge them a lot of times, and that's why it makes a lot of sense to look at the actual performance of the business of the history, because they can't change the past. Now we can talk about some of the methods that we use to actually perform. Okay, here we go. Got a little animation. One of the approaches we use is an asset approach. Essentially, it's the assets of the business less the liabilities of the business is the net assets, or the equity. This makes a lot of sense for companies that are not producing positive cash flows, potentially operating loss type companies, or if the primary business is really just holding assets. You think about it, if it's a like a family partnership, they own a bunch of stocks and bonds and marketable securities, then there's really not a lot other than just holding a portfolio. So it makes sense to just look at what the assets are. Most of the time, if it's an operating company, we'll use some other type of approach, just because cost is really sort of the floor value. For example, income approach, you'll see primarily a discounted cash flow approach, which we were hinting at before. We're essentially taking forward-looking estimates developed together with management for cash flows, and discounting them to today's dollars. And a sort of piece of that analysis is this capitalized cash flow method, where you're essentially getting to one normal period of cash flows and then discounting that at a capitalization rate. So there's a lot kind of loaded terminology there that we'll try to walk through a little bit. But essentially the benefit of the discounted cash flow method is that you can take into account several different assumptions year to year. Maybe growth is not going to be stable for the next couple of years, and so you can trend things out. Maybe the margins and profitability of the business will change. Maybe they're investing at different amounts, capital expenditures type thing, over the next few years. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility in what the future of the business looks like. With the capitalization type approach, you're assuming that the business has reached some kind of normal level of cash flow and that there's going to be stable growth going forward. So there's some ways to challenge both types of approaches from a litigated setting, as far as, is the business at a normalized, stable cash flow level? I don't know. Should you have considered something forward-looking? However, if you consider something forward-looking, tell me about how you got to your forward-looking assumptions and all these judgment-based inputs. Another approach is a market-based approach, where we would look at transactions for similar companies in the same or similar industries, and calculate multiples based on actual transactions. Several different places we can get that type of information. Public companies do a lot of deals, so we'll look at that type of indications of value, specifically revenue multiples, earnings multiples, book equity multiples, those kinds of things. Subject company transactions is an interesting one. That would be where if I'm a business owner and I sold part of my ownership interest last year, that's an indication of value for this year, the value of this year. Obviously, things can change in the business over the past year, but the fact that you sold the subject company's shares last year at $10 a share means, well, that's a good benchmark to look at. Well, has it gone up from $10? So it's a good kind of indicator. And then, depending on the size of the company and if we're able to make reasonable comparisons to public companies, we can use multiples based on equity markets.
So one important thing here is that for an actual valuation engagement to be performed, the valuation expert has to consider all three methods of valuation: cost approach, income approach, and market approach. If you ask them that and they haven't considered all three, then that is definitely grounds for calling the entire analysis into question. Now, you have to consider all three. You don't necessarily have to rely on all three. But this is important to know because, let's say your opposing expert says, well, I've looked at the income approach and this company's worth $1 million, or this company's worth $100,000. Well, if you know that the company has several $1 million in assets and not very many liabilities, and they just had a bad year last year, and he's used that bad year as the indication of value for the income approach, then you know that he should have looked at the asset approach and said, well, listen, we've got several millions of dollars worth of assets here. Couldn't you just sell the assets? And it's worth much more than $100,000. So it's all in context, and you've got to consider all three approaches.
Yeah, I mean, there's a million different scenarios that you can kind of come up with as far as what approach is best and what makes sense. But you have floor value there with the cost approach, and maybe it was one bad year, maybe they've never made money and they're just sitting on. You think about maybe franchises or something like that, professional franchises where they cash out when they sell the business. Those kinds of things all come into play. Some thoughts on normalization. The idea is that we're really trying to get to what an average or normal level of business cash flows to an equity holder are, and there's all kinds of things that we'll do to try and tease out any issues that we see with the historical financials. We can try and identify one-time expenses, investments that were for some kind of catastrophic event, things that don't typically happen. We'll look at common size statements, which is really just trying to see from year to year, have there been significant changes in any of the ratios, expense levels, those kinds of things. And it helps us identify issues with the historicals that might cause significant value changes when you're looking at a normal period. It also helps us make comparisons to other companies in the same industry. You want to try and remove any of the noise, essentially. Part of the issue there is that there can be some subjectivity with, well, what's normal, and how are you basing your decision about this needs to be added back as a cost. Think about like executive compensation, maybe. If you're a business owner, you can kind of set your own compensation. Well, would you be able to hire somebody else to do that same job at half the salary? Well, maybe, maybe not. There's a lot of judgment involved there. There could be some intangible assets that the specific owner brings to the firm that you could, try and support.
Yeah, and it's important to note that a small adjustment in one of these normalizing adjustments can turn out to be a much larger impact based on the multiple that the valuation is. So if you got a company with $100,000 in earnings and you're saying it's worth $1 million, that's a 10 times multiple. Well, any dollar that you add back in some sort of a normalization adjustment is really $10. So a $10,000 adjustment is really $100,000 of value impact.
And maybe it makes some sense to even think about what could be considered an adjustment. If you're thinking about this concept of fair market value and what somebody would pay for your business, you'd be removing a lot of expenses that are personal in nature. If we're looking at a family business where the owners are involved in day-to-day operations and they're running, business, meals and entertainment kind of expenses through the business, they're paying for their kid's car payment comes out of the Amex account. All those kinds of things that maybe a hypothetical buyer would identify and be like, wait a minute, I'm not paying for your kid's Escalade or whatever. So those are kind of things that we would be looking to identify and support add backs.
And I would want my attorney in direct examination to walk me through each one of those add backs so that I could provide my support for them. And I would expect the same thing in cross examination. I would want someone asking an opposing expert for their support for each and every one of those, because, like I discussed, there is a sensitivity there where some of these smaller adjustments can still end up being a relatively large number once they're multiplied by the company's multiple.
We've talked a little bit about discount rates, which is essentially a proxy for an expected return. A lot of different ways to estimate a discount rate or a return that an investor might expect for any specific business. The way that we typically look at it for smaller size companies is some kind of build-up approach where we start with some risk-free rate and then add in premiums for the fact that it's an equity investment, the smaller size of the company, its specific industry, and then there's this one that's real heavy on the judgment, is this company-specific premium. And that one is certainly one that's likely to be contested. And there's we've seen a lot of funny things happen when it comes to that plug. Well, you assume it's not a plug, but you'll see where, we need to get to a discount rate of 15% to make the valuation look the way we want it to look. So we're going to plug that company-specific rate. And that's real hairy. So, if you see strange numbers in the buildup of a discount rate, it's certainly worth flagging and making sure that if your valuation expert is using some kind of company-specific premium, that they've got real good support for why they did it.
Yeah, if an expert's looking to get to a certain number, which I would consider unethical, but it happens, this is where they're probably most likely to do it, is this company-specific risk premium. So you're going to want to walk through their buildup of their discount rate, whether it be, did they use the buildup approach, did they use the CAPM model, whatever. All of these things are empirically based. There's a lot of data out there, market data since 1920 to today, that people have run all kinds of regressions, and I won't bore you with the details, but there's a lot of support out there that is objective. And then we've got this one piece that is the company-specific risk premium that can just be manipulated, essentially, if there's not substantial support for it. And so I would say, anything above 2 or 3% in a company-specific risk premium probably requires some sort of extenuating circumstances or very well-documented support for it, because otherwise, really, any sort of industry risks or general economic risks should really be already baked into the empirical data that we've used.
And you can. We know that there are companies that are high return type companies, and that the underlying sort of buildup doesn't really get you to what you would actually expect as a return. And so there's that piece that's like, well, we know that there's some really high return that we would expect from this. It's a real small company, it's a high tech company, something like that. But I would make the case that you really want to maybe adjust somewhere else in the analysis. You want, when you present a high company specific premium, you're recognizing that the underlying cash flows that you're using in whatever approach that you're applying the discount rate to, that you don't have a lot of confidence in those cash flows. And so that's a red flag right there. So my preference would be to go reassess the cash flows that you've built up and try to get a more reasonable number there so that you can use a more reasonable company-specific premium. This is kind of another kind of key takeaway as far as the relationship between value and returns or discount rates. Essentially, you probably heard high risk, high return. That it certainly comes into play when you're talking about discount rates. The more risky an investment is, the higher you would expect a return to be. And then the inverse is true when it comes to price or value and discount rates. So the higher the discount rate, the lower the value is. So that's a key concept there when you're talking about or you're asking questions to an opposing expert or having discussions with your attorney or whoever about, well, we think the discount rate should be higher, when that implies that you think the value should be lower. So be careful the way you kind of talk about discount rates there. Again, this is certainly a contested piece of an analysis, given there's a lot of subjectivity in the way you build up, or there's some underlying inputs there. And again, kind of hit on the sensitivity piece there. A small percentage change in discount rate could have a material impact on your conclusions.
Yeah, so here I think it would be a good idea to have your own expert, during direct examination, just illustrate that for the judge and say, Mr. Morgan, if there was a 1% change in the discount rate, what would be the approximate impact in your valuation? And just so that kind of gets out there, if you think the opposing expert is goosing one of their discount numbers to get to a certain value, it can kind of help put in the judge's mind the impact. Even though it's just a 1 or 2% change, it could be several $1 million. So
let me kind of present a sample buildup here. Again, it's really just starting with the risk-free rate and then throwing in layers of different premiums for different reasons: the small size of the company, the industry it operates in, and then company-specific area. And then if we're doing a debt-free type analysis in the cash flow, we actually weight the equity return with some level of after-tax debt return. Debt's cheaper than equity, so it's lower discount rate, and your blended rate will be somewhere kind of in between based on your estimated capital structure of the firm. It's probably a lot to throw at you there. The concept of a cap rate or capitalization rate is related to the discount rate. It's really just the discount rate less whatever you're estimating as a long-term sustainable growth rate. And again, you're using a discount rate if you're doing a discounted cash flow approach, and a capitalization rate if you're doing a sort of one-period normalized capitalization approach. So there's a little bit of a difference there, and the difference could be whatever you're estimating as the long-term growth rate. And we've seen that you can also estimate long-term growth rates very differently. My perspective is that it's really should be based on some kind of long-term economic growth, which would be difficult to prove would be any more than maybe 2 or 3%. Even that might be aggressive at this point.
Yeah, and if the company is going to grow faster than that in sometime in the future, I would say that it should probably be represented in the cash flows.
Right.
So anything above 3%, you're going to have a hard time convincing me that the economy in general is going to grow into perpetuity. Because remember, in this analysis, we're talking about forever, and anything over 2 or 3% just isn't realistic for any company.
Now we're going to talk about discounts, premiums, specifically for lack of control or marketability. This comes into play when you're talking about an ownership interest that maybe is not a controlling owner. Sort of the standard valuation would get you to some kind of control level number, which assumes that you have power to change all the cost structure of the business, you can change the strategic direction of the firm, you can change the amount of money you're spending on marketing, all those kinds of things. Those are control level assumptions. And here we're trying to recognize that you would pay less for 40% of a company than you would pay for 60%, based on the fact that you have the ability to change the direction of the firm. So we recognize that if we're performing analysis for a minority position, then we would apply some level of control, discount for lack of control. That number, it can be subjective, and there are studies out there. We can base it on empirical actual transactions that have occurred. However, every business is different, and so the premium you would pay or the discount, the implied discount, could be very different business to business. So again, you want to make sure that your expert has got solid support for whatever decision they make as far as discounts. And then the marketability piece is trying to reflect that a privately held company cannot be really sold, and you can't cash out of a private business in 3 days like you can on the stock market. So you have to reflect that there's significant costs involved in selling a business. Maybe you're paying a broker, maybe you're hiring an iBank, something like that. Those are the kinds of things that when we're doing our analysis, we're kind of baking into that marketability discount. And there could be some discounts for voting rights. Obviously, if you have no voting power, that is different than if you can vote and have a say. So there would be a discount there. We see the error made occasionally that you can just add those discounts up, and the appropriate application is really sequential. You take the discount for control and then apply the discount for marketability after that. It's just kind of something interesting to note that comes up occasionally. Again, it's definitely a contested piece of an analysis, just given the subjectivity and the fact that most of the empirical data is either for public companies or for restricted stock that is not really applicable to whatever the subject is, much smaller businesses. And so really it's the valuation expert's judgment involved in, well, how do we adjust or how do we use that empirical data and apply it in our setting?
Yeah, and I've seen, actually just recently I saw an expert basically had no support for their discounts for lack of control and lack of marketability, in addition to actually not taking them sequentially and just blending them into one rate. But that's another story. But this particular expert basically just said, I think the discounts are 35% because that's what I've, in my experience, have seen in the industry, and I just can't imagine that flying with the judge. There's pre-IPO studies, there's restricted stock studies, they've done studies on put options. There are former court cases, the Mandelbaum case in particular, that actually discuss discounts and certain criteria and also help quantify the discounts. So there's a lot of stuff out there that, it is a judgment call, but there's a lot of stuff out there to where you can put, if you've got a 35% lack of marketability, you can certainly support that with data.
Yeah, and this one's kind of an interesting one to talk about, like the sensitivity to your actual conclusions, because these are typically applied at the end of the analysis. So it can be a dollar for dollar impact. So if the difference in these discounts between two different experts is 10%, then that's really like a 10% value difference between the two. So that certainly can be material. As far as deliverables go, and this is kind of what when we're being retained, there's different levels of service, if you will. A calculation is not a valuation. We'll often be asked to kind of do something quick and dirty, and that is kind of red flags for us because it typically means that somebody is giving us the guidance that you need to perform a specific set of procedures and essentially ignore some of the other considerations that normally would go into evaluation. Most likely it's, you can ignore some of the other approaches. Like, we just need a DCF. And that's one of those things where it's like, sure, we can do that, but we're not going to say that that's our opinion about value because we haven't considered all of the other possible outcomes from different approaches. So it's definitely, you got some definitely red flag.
Yeah, in a valuation engagement, the definition, by definition, the analyst is free to use whatever methods they think is appropriate. And so if you box them in via this calculation report, it's not, you're unable to render an opinion because you haven't considered everything. And it's not your opinion, you're just doing, that's why it's called a calculation. So.
Yeah, so obviously there's limited procedures there, so that's kind of the cheap option. So, and it's not that we're trying to sell anybody on doing heavier work. It's just that we know from past experience that if you give us some fees to do additional research and all those things, then we're going to be able to generate a better result for you. We're going to be way more confident that whatever we're delivering to you is supportable, and we'll stand behind that, and that's our actual opinion. So that's kind of that summary report level where we can do our best to limit the bulk. You'll see a lot of times 100-page reports, which kind of get into that detailed report. They're doing all kinds of high-level, in-depth analysis on the industry and all those things. That's something that obviously you're going to run up costs on. So our kind of wheelhouse is that summary report where we feel comfortable in the amount of work we've done and kicked the tires and documented our assumptions and all that. But not necessarily just doing back-of-the-napkin type stuff. Some other kind of considerations here as far as in a litigated setting is it's really important that we as valuation experts have as much information as possible or access to management, ownership, the accountants, whoever knows the business the best, because that allows us to make appropriate adjustments, allows us to assess the risk of the business, ask questions and get answers that are reasonable. And we often have this issue that in a litigated setting that we're working for one side, and there potentially is motivation to not provide information or deceive or intentionally withhold things because they know that they're dragging out skeletons or something that there's going to be a value impact on. So as an independent person who's doing their best to provide a fair market value analysis, we're not motivated to have a high value or a low value, even though we're retained by a specific side. We just want the right value. And that's something that comes up frequently, is we're never really sure if what we're hearing from management or whoever is reliable. And so we do our best to kind of pressure test a lot of the inputs. If they're telling us that the business is going to grow at 10% every year for the next 10 years, we'll kind of try and temper our expectations and how we incorporate some of the things that management tells us. But there is some limit to what we're able to do if we're being told that that's their perspective on reality. So that's kind of an interesting piece. Anything to add there?
I mean, I would just say, as we're wrapping this up, there are three main things that you're going to want to pay attention to in evaluation, of your own expert or of your opposing expert, and that's really the three areas that are kind of ripe for contention, and that's the discount rate, that's the normalization adjustments, and the discount for lack of marketability and lack of control. Those are the three areas that are going to be the most contentious between the two sides as far as the valuation goes. So if you have limited time in reviewing an opposing expert's valuation, I would really focus on the cross-examination of those three aspects.
Yeah. That's actually all we had prepared. Appreciate it. Certainly willing to take any questions. Any specific issues that might have popped up in your experience? Yep.
A couple of questions. Do you have any good stories about the difference in values when you're in opposing expert situations?
Oh yeah, I mean all the time.
Every story is a good story.
I mean, I
They're
can't
always different.
mention any names, but I mean, just recently there was a local business. Everyone in here would know it. Several locations, family owned and operated, easily over $20 million in difference. I think we had it at $55 million, and the opposing expert came in and said it was worth like $20 million or something. And
There's a lot of judgment involved in what is a fair rate of rent that you would pay on this building, if it's a related party rent. So let's say mom owns the land and the building, and dad owns the operations, and they're cross-charging each other, and so there's this issue about, well, what would you pay rent if dad wasn't owning the business or owning the I'm not sure how I set that up, but if it wasn't a related party transaction, what would you pay? So there's a lot of judgment involved there for sure. Not sure about any other fiery ones.
yeah,
They're all fiery, but
yeah, I mean, you see it a lot. There are a lot of experts out there that are just for hire, and our opinion is that we just want to get to the right value. But like I said, there are just a lot of areas in evaluation that are ripe for manipulation, and so we see it all the time. And it's also just kind of comes with the industry that everyone just has their own opinion.
Yeah,
of value. So if I did evaluation and Ben did evaluation on the same company with the same set of facts, we would probably come to at least a slightly different number.
Yeah, it's just like any public company. There's 20 different banks putting out reports that say, oh, this one's a buy, this one's a buy, this one's a sell, right? So everyone's got a different sort of perspective about what's going to happen in the future, because largely the valuation boils down to your expectations about where the business is going, as it regards to what it's worth to you today. So that's where you come into. There's again just a ton of area that is judgment, and what do you think the business is going to grow at? Where what's reasonable compensation for owners? All those kinds of things for sure come in. Anyone else? Yep.
If my client has the money, I would love to do a business valuation. He does not have the money for it, though. Do you have any suggestions?
The one thing that we've done that we're starting to do more of to kind of save on fees, because, you know, you get the situation where you got one party that, you know, they hire their expert, and then you got the other party, they hire their expert, and then there's all kinds of money spent haggling over everything. Well, what we've done several times now is we get hired by both parties, and we're a neutral valuator. We basically, you know, all the communications are disclosed, you know, between both sides, and so everything's out in the open, and we use our independent judgment to come to a value. And so that saves half. Other than that, I mean,
I would say you can suggest or recommend some kind of limited procedure and say, you know, you can have them put together a forecast for you. And what I would do is try and push as much of the work onto your client and management and say, we need you guys to do the forecast. We need you guys to build up some cash flows. We'll review things. We'll take it and sort of, you know, dump it into our model and see how it kind of shakes out. But we certainly wouldn't call it a valuation. We would say maybe that's an indication for your purposes, planning, and something like that. You can't rely on that. We would put some kind of disclaimer in there. You can't rely on this in like a sale or something like that. But you know, if it's just like, oh, I want a size check kind of thing, we can certainly limit the procedures.
and if you were going to use I wouldn't recommend just kind of going online and searching for some sort of a rule of thumb multiple, because you're really leaving your client open to,
You leave money
the
on
other
the
side's
table.
going to eat your lunch.
Yeah, if it's someone who's considering a sale and they just go on and pull a multiple, then they could be leaving a ton of money on the table. When it comes to identifying those add backs, if it's a family business, or just maybe the data you're pulling offline is just garbage data. So I mean, there's a lot of red flags there with information out there. Anybody else? All right. Appreciate the time.